On Harry Truman's desk sat a small sign, handmade from a piece of glass and painted wood. It read, "The buck stops here." Truman meant it. He was the president who took responsibility for dropping the atomic bomb, who fired Douglas MacArthur when the general defied him. Harry Truman believed the president was in charge, and that being in charge meant knowing what was done in your name and answering for it, which makes what happened on June 18th, 1948, one of the stranger moments in American history. On that day, President Truman approved a document called NSC 10/2. It was a National Security Council directive, not a law passed by Congress, not an executive order published for the public, but an internal policy document that came up through the bureaucracy. It was classified, and it would remain classified for decades. NSC 10/2 authorized the government to conduct covert operations, propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, support for guerrilla movements, and underground resistance. These were things the United States was now officially in the business of doing, but the document contained a particular phrase, a phrase that would shape American government for the next 70 years. It said these operations should be so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. Plausibly disclaim any responsibility. The buck stops here, President had just signed off on a system designed to ensure the buck would never arrive. Truman almost certainly did not write this language. He almost certainly did not sit at his desk and think carefully about the implications of building deniability into the structure of government. The document came to him the way documents come to presidents, up through channels, drafted by staff, vetted by advisors, and presented for signature. So who did write it? The answer is George F. Kennan. If you've taken a course in diplomatic history or international relations, you know that name. Kennan was the author of the Long Telegram, the 1946 cable from Moscow that first articulated the strategy of containment. He followed it with the famous X article in Foreign Affairs, published anonymously, which laid out the intellectual framework for how America would confront the Soviet Union for the next 4 decades. Kennan is one of the most celebrated diplomatic minds of the 20th century. He won the Pulitzer Prize twice, the National Book Award twice. He lived to 101 and was consulted by presidents across half a century. What's almost never mentioned is that the same man, in the same period, was quietly building something else. In the spring of 1948, Kennan was director of the State Department's policy planning staff, and he was worried. The Soviets were winning the war of ideas in Europe. Communist parties were gaining strength in Italy and France. Kennan believed the United States needed to fight back, not with armies, but with what he called political warfare. In May 1948, he submitted a paper to the National Security Council titled The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. It proposed supporting exile groups from behind the Iron Curtain, funding radio broadcasts and publications, backing indigenous anti-communist movements, a war fought with ideas and information. But the language Kennan drafted was broad, very broad. The directive didn't just authorize propaganda and cultural programs. It authorized preventative direct action, including sabotage, and subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, sabotage, guerrillas, subversion. And critically, Kennan's framework included that phrase about plausible deniability. The operations would be structured so the government could deny them. There was at least one person in 1948 who saw exactly what was happening and tried to stop it. His name was Roscoe Hillenkotter. He was the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA. Hillenkotter understood what Kennan was building. He understood that the new Office of Policy Coordination, which would run these covert operations, was being set up outside his control. It would technically be part of the CIA, but it would take its orders from the State Department and the Pentagon. Hillenkotter would have no real authority over it. He wrote a memo complaining that Kennan's plan would establish a staff function providing for authority in a delicate field of operations without the responsibility. Authority without responsibility. That was the design. The man who took charge of the Office of Policy Coordination was Frank Wisner, a veteran of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, who had conducted covert operations in Romania. Wisner was not interested in limiting himself to radio broadcasts and literary magazines. As one CIA deputy inspector later recalled, Wisner and his staff arrogated themselves total power, with no inhibiting precedent. They could do what they wanted, just as long as the higher authority, as we called the president, did not expressly forbid it. Think about what that means. The standard wasn't that the president authorized operations. The standard was that the president hadn't specifically said no. And how could he say no to something he was never told about? For 4 years, the Office of Policy Coordination operated with what one intelligence insider called astonishing independence. Wisner built an ambitious agenda: psychological warfare, political warfare, economic warfare. The budget grew, the operations multiplied, and the government, as Keenan's language specified, maintained the ability to plausibly disclaim any responsibility. Keenan watched what happened to his creation. Years later, testifying before the Church Committee, the Senate investigation that would finally expose what the intelligence agencies had been doing, Keenan offered his verdict. The political warfare initiative, he said, was the greatest mistake I ever made. It did not work out at all the way I had conceived it. But Keenan's regret was selective. He remained proud of Radio Free Europe. He defended the covert funding of intellectuals and cultural organizations, even after the scandals broke in the 1960s. This country has no Ministry of Culture, he wrote, and the CIA was obliged to do what it could to fill the gap. It should be praised for having done so, not criticized. So Keenan drew a line. Funding ideas, good. Funding coups and assassination attempts, bad. The problem was that the architecture he built didn't draw that line. The language was broad. The oversight was weak. Some would say even non-existent. The deniability was baked in. And once you build a machine designed to operate without the president knowing, you cannot control what it does. So here's where we are by the early 1950s. The United States government had created a formal system for conducting operations that the president can deny. The structure is designed so that information flows around the Oval Office, not into it. The CIA director himself has been cut out of parts of it, and the man who built the architecture is already watching it escape his control. Harry Truman, the buck stops here president, has approved a framework that ensures certain bucks will never reach his desk or his successor's desk. He will leave office in 1953. A decade later, another president will discover just how well the system works. The director who didn't know. John McCone was not a spy. He was an industrialist, a shipbuilder, a Republican who had made a fortune in steel and shipping during World War II, then served in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, managing weapons procurement and atomic energy. When President Kennedy appointed him Director of Central Intelligence in 1961, McCone was 60 years old, a devout Catholic, and a Washington outsider. That last part mattered. McCone came into the CIA as a manager, not an intelligence professional. He hadn't come up through the ranks. He didn't know the culture, the history, the unwritten rules. He didn't know where the bodies were buried, in some cases literally, and the agency didn't rush to tell him. By the time McCone took over, the CIA had been running operations to eliminate Fidel Castro for more than a year. Not just eliminate his government, eliminate him. The agency had reached out to the Mafia. The logic, such as it was, ran like this. Organized crime had operated casinos in Havana before Castro's revolution, and the mob wanted back in. The CIA wanted Castro dead, a partnership of convenience. Through intermediaries, the agency made contact with figures including Johnny Roselli, a Las Vegas mobster, and Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. There were discussions of poison pills, poison cigars, contaminated diving suits. The plots had an almost absurdist quality, but they were real, and they had been authorized at high levels within the agency. When McCone became director, these operations were ongoing. No one told him. The new director of Central Intelligence was not informed that his agency was collaborating with the American Mafia to assassinate a foreign head of state. How does this happen? How does the man ostensibly in charge of an organization not know about one of its most sensitive operations? Part of the answer is bureaucratic. The Castro plots had been compartmentalized, kept within a small circle, with information shared on a strict need-to-know basis. The people running the operations made a judgment that the new director didn't need to know. Part of the answer is cultural. McCone was an outsider. He hadn't earned the trust of the clandestine service veterans who actually ran operations. There was a sense within the agency that directors came and went, but the professionals endured. You protected operations from political appointees who might not understand, who might get cold feet, who might talk. And part of the answer is the architecture that Keenan built, the system designed for deniability. Information was supposed to be contained. The less the higher-ups knew, the more plausibility they could deny. The doctrine had been created to protect the president, now is being used to keep the CIA director himself in the dark. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Within a week, President Johnson created the Warren Commission to investigate. Chief Justice Earl Warren would lead it. The commission would have access to the full resources of the federal government. The CIA pledged its cooperation. John McCone, still Director of Central Intelligence, was the agency's primary point of contact with the commission. And now McCone faced a problem. At some point after Kennedy's death, the exact timeline remains disputed, McCone learned about the Castro assassination plots. He learned that his agency had been working with the Mafia. The Warren Commission was investigating why the president was killed. The CIA had been trying to kill a foreign leader who had every reason to want revenge. This seemed like relevant information. McCone did not share it with the Warren Commission. Why? Historians and investigators have debated this for decades. McCone, in later testimony, suggested he hadn't fully understood the scope of the plots, or hadn't connected them to the assassination investigation. Others have been less charitable. But notice the irony of the situation. McCone didn't tell the Warren Commission about the Castro plots because he would later indicate he hadn't been fully informed about them himself. The system designed to keep presidents ignorant had kept the CIA director ignorant. And then that ignorance, or the partial knowledge that followed, was passed along to the commission investigating the president's murder. McCone would leave the CIA in 1965. The Castro plots would remain secret for another decade, until the Church Committee finally pried them loose. When the committee asked how the Director of Central Intelligence could have been kept ignorant of such significant operations, the answers were bureaucratic, procedural, passive-voiced. It was compartmentalized. It was need to know. It was the way things were done. No one, as far as we know, had ordered McCone to be kept in the dark. No one needed to. The system produced that outcome automatically. So now we have two data points. Truman signed off on a framework for deniability without fully understanding what he was approving. McCone ran the CIA without being told what his agency was doing. The machine was working. Information flowed around the people who were nominally in charge, not to them. And everyone could deny what they didn't know. 2 decades later, someone would finally say the quiet part out loud, in broad daylight. On July 15, 1987, a retired Navy admiral sat at a witness table in the Senate caucus room, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. John Poindexter had served as National Security Advisor to President Ronald Reagan from 1985 to 1986. He was a nuclear physicist, an Annapolis graduate, a decorated officer who had risen to the rank of vice admiral. He had been at the center of American national security policy during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Now he was testifying before a joint congressional committee investigating what had become known as the Iran-Contra affair. The committee wanted to know what President Reagan knew and when he knew it. Poindexter had an answer, and it was unlike anything Congress had heard before. The Iran-Contra affair was actually 2 scandals that had been welded together. The first involved Iran. Despite a public policy against negotiating with terrorists or selling weapons to hostile states, the Reagan administration had secretly sold arms to Iran. The hope was that Iran would use its influence to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. The deals were conducted through intermediaries, with the president's approval, in violation of stated policy and arguably of law. The second scandal involved Nicaragua. The Reagan administration was determined to support the Contras, a rebel group fighting the socialist Sandinista government. But Congress had passed the Boland Amendments, which restricted and then prohibited U.S. government support for the Contras. The administration faced a choice: obey the law or find another way. They found another way. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a National Security Council staff member, devised a scheme. The profits from the Iranian arms sales, money that belonged to the U.S. government, would be diverted to fund the Contras. The operation would be run out of the White House basement, off the books, away from congressional oversight. It was, in the assessment of the committees that investigated it, a shadow foreign policy run by unelected staff, funded by secret arms deals, in defiance of congressional restrictions of law. When the scheme unraveled in late 1986, the question became, did the president know? Reagan's defenders pointed to his management style. He was a delegator. He set broad policy goals and left implementation to his staff. He didn't get into the weeds. It was plausible, even likely, that the president had approved the general policy of supporting the Contras and seeking hostage releases, without knowing the operational details of how his staff was accomplishing those goals. But plausible was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The committees investigating Iran-Contra needed to know, was the president ignorant because the details never reached him, or was he ignorant because someone made sure the details never reached him? John Poindexter provided the answer. Under questioning, Poindexter acknowledged that he had known about the diversion of funds to the Contras. He had authorized it. Oliver North had briefed him. The committee asked the obvious question, did you tell the president? Poindexter said no. The follow-up was inevitable. Why not? And here Poindexter said something remarkable. He said he made a deliberate decision not to inform President Reagan about the diversion. Why? I made a very deliberate decision not to ask the president so that I could insulate him from from the decision and provide some future deniability for the president if it ever leaked out. There it was. Not a denial, not an evasion, not a claim that the information never reached him, or that he forgot, or that he didn't understand its significance. A deliberate decision to keep the president ignorant, made explicitly so that the president could deny knowledge, testified to under oath on national television as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. Poindexter went further. When asked about the chain of command, about ultimate responsibility, about where the buck stopped, he offered his own version of Truman's motto. "The buck stops here," Poindexter said, "with me." Not with the president, with the National Security Advisor. In Poindexter's telling, he had taken it upon himself to make decisions about the diversion of government funds to foreign military operations, decisions that implicated potential violations of law, that contradicted stated policy, that could have sparked an international incident, and he had done so without informing the president, precisely so the president wouldn't be responsible. He was protecting Reagan. That was the defense. But think about what this means. 40 years after George Kennan wrote NSC 10/2, the doctrine of plausible deniability had migrated from covert operations abroad to the internal functioning of the White House itself. It was no longer just about being able to deny that the U.S. government had sabotaged a factory in Eastern Europe or supported a coup in Guatemala. It was about the president's own staff structuring information flows so the president could deny knowledge of what his own administration was doing. The National Security Advisor had decided, on his own authority, what the president should know and what he shouldn't know. He had made that decision not because the information was unimportant, but because it was explosive. Not to protect national security, but to protect the president from accountability. And he said so, out loud, in broad daylight, under oath, as a justification. The congressional committees were not impressed. Their final report noted that Poindexter's defense raises profound issues about the functioning of government. If a national security advisor could decide what the president should know, based on what might be politically damaging, then the president was not actually in charge of the executive branch. He was a figurehead being managed by his staff. The report quoted Truman. The buck stops with the president. That was the constitutional design. That was the theory of executive accountability. Poindexter had testified that the buck stopped with him. Someone was wrong. Reagan himself was never charged with any crime. The independent counsel's report concluded that the president's conduct fell well short of criminality, while noting that Reagan had created the conditions which made possible the crimes committed by others. The president didn't actually know, and because he didn't know, he wasn't responsible. And he didn't know because his national security advisor made a deliberate decision to keep him ignorant. The architecture of deniability had worked. Poindexter was convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of Congress, and making false statements. His convictions were later overturned on appeal, because the testimony he gave under immunity had influenced his trial. Oliver North was also convicted, and his convictions were also overturned on similar grounds. No one served prison time for the diversion of funds to the Contras. The system held. The president was protected. Accountability evaporated somewhere in the chain of command. So now we have 3 data points of a president being kept from information he should know. Truman approved a framework for deniability without understanding its implications. McCone was kept ignorant by his own agency. Reagan was kept ignorant by his own national security advisor, deliberately, admittedly, as a matter of policy. The doctrine of plausible deniability, born in 1948 as a tool for covert operations abroad, had become something else. It had become a theory of governance, a way of running the executive branch, a reason for staff to decide, on their own initiative, what the president should and shouldn't know. But here's the thing. Plausible deniability gave the practice a name. It gave it a rationale. It wrapped it in the language of national security and executive function. Before that, people just did it. No doctrine, no justification, no pretense of protecting anyone. They simply didn't tell the president. And to see that, we have to go back, not to the Cold War, not to the 20th century even, to 1859, to a Secretary of War with a secret, and a president who had no idea what was happening in his own cabinet. Before the doctrine. Everything we've discussed so far has a certain logic to it. Kennan built a system for deniability because he believed the Cold War required it. McCone was kept in the dark through compartmentalization, a security practice with at least a theoretical justification. Poindexter kept Reagan ignorant to protect him, which is perverse but at least coherent as a motivation. These men had reasons. They operated within a framework, however corrupted that framework had become. They could point to national security, to the Soviet threat, to the need for the president to maintain credibility on the world stage. The reasons might not justify what they did, but the reasons existed. What's striking about the earlier history is how little justification anyone bothered to provide. Before plausible deniability became a doctrine, before anyone had written a policy paper about protecting the president's ability to deny, cabinet members simply kept presidents in the dark when it suited them. They didn't theorize about it. They didn't write memos explaining their reasoning. They just did it. And the case that illustrates this most clearly takes us to the final years before the Civil War, to an administration paralyzed by the coming catastrophe, and to a Secretary of War who was quietly preparing for a conflict his president still believed could be avoided. James Buchanan is routinely ranked among the worst presidents in American history. This is not entirely fair to Buchanan. The forces pulling the nation apart in the late 1850s would have challenged anyone, but is not entirely unfair either. Buchanan was a Northerner with Southern sympathies, a Democrat who owed his election to Southern votes, a legalist who believed the Constitution gave him no power to prevent secession, even as he also believed secession was illegal. He was a man frozen between contradictions, and his cabinet reflected that paralysis. His Secretary of War was John B. Floyd of Virginia. Floyd had been governor of Virginia before joining Buchanan's cabinet in 1857. He was a slaveholder and, as events would reveal, a man whose loyalties were not entirely with the government he served. What Floyd did between 1859 and 1860, and what Buchanan knew about it, tells us something important about information and power in the executive branch. It tells us that the problem didn't start with the Cold War. It didn't start with the CIA. It started as soon as there was a cabinet and a president who couldn't watch everything his cabinet did. In 1859 and 1860, as sectional tensions escalated and Southern states began openly discussing secession, Secretary of War Floyd undertook a quiet project. He ordered the transfer of federal weapons, muskets, rifles, ammunition, from arsenals in the North to arsenals in the South. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of roughly a year, Floyd transferred approximately 115,000 weapons from facilities like the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and the Watervliet Arsenal in New York to federal arsenals in states that would soon form the Confederacy. His justification, when questioned, was administrative. The Southern arsenals were underfunded. The weapons were needed there. It was a routine rebalancing of federal assets. But the effect was anything but routine. When Southern states seceded and seized federal property within their borders, they captured arsenals stocked with weapons that Floyd had provided. The United States Army would spend the next 4 years fighting against soldiers armed with weapons that the U.S. Secretary of War had shipped south. Buchanan was not fully aware of what Floyd was doing. The president understood in a general sense that his Secretary of War was managing Army logistics. He did not understand that Floyd was systematically arming what would become the enemy. This was not plausible deniability. No one sat down and crafted a policy to keep the president ignorant. No one theorized about protecting Buchanan's ability to deny knowledge. Floyd simply didn't tell him. And Buchanan, overwhelmed by the cascading crises of a disintegrating Union, didn't ask. There was a moment when the dam almost broke. In late December 1860, after South Carolina had seceded, the question of federal forts in Charleston Harbor became acute. Major Robert Anderson commanded a small garrison at Fort Moultrie, an indefensible position. Anderson requested guidance. What should he do if South Carolina demanded he surrender? The command structure for this decision ran through the Secretary of War. Floyd handled the correspondence himself, cutting out General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the Army, from the chain of communication. When Anderson, on his own initiative, moved his garrison from Fort Moultrie to the more defensible Fort Sumter, Floyd was furious. He had been maneuvering to keep the forts vulnerable to avoid any provocation of the southern states. Floyd demanded that Buchanan order Anderson back to Fort Moultrie. President Buchanan initially agreed. Then he changed his mind. Floyd resigned on December 29, 1860, citing Buchanan's refusal to reverse Anderson's move to Fort Sumter. Within days of his resignation, Floyd was accused of fraud, specifically of having endorsed bonds that didn't belong to him in a scheme involving government contracts, an embezzlement scandal. It had been brewing for months, hidden from the president, tangled up with Floyd's other activities. The accusations against Floyd multiplied after his departure. Congress investigated. Critics accused him of treason, of deliberately arming the South in anticipation of secession. Floyd's defenders pointed to his administrative incompetence and the chaos of the period. He was a Southern sympathizer, surely, but was he a traitor? The question never received a definitive legal answer. Floyd went south, briefly served as a Confederate general, badly, and died in 1863. But the question of what Buchanan knew and when he knew it has a clear answer. Buchanan didn't know what his Secretary of War was doing, not the full scope of the arms transfers, not the maneuvering around Fort Sumter, not the embezzlement. Floyd kept him in the dark, not to protect the president, not pursuant to any doctrine, simply because Floyd had his own agenda, and an informed president would have been an obstacle to it. This is what executive branch information control looked like before the 20th century professionalized it. There was no policy, no framework, no National Security Council directive with carefully crafted language about deniability. There was just a cabinet secretary doing what he wanted and not telling the president. The Constitution vests the executive power in the president. The president appoints the cabinet. The cabinet serves at his pleasure. In theory, the president is in charge. In practice, the president knows what people tell him. And from the earliest days of the Republic, there have been people in the executive branch who decided, for reasons good or bad or self-serving or ideological, not to tell him. John B. Floyd didn't need a doctrine to keep Buchanan ignorant. Frank Wisner didn't need Kennan's permission to expand covert operations beyond what Kennan envisioned. The CIA officers who hid the Castro plots from McCone didn't need anyone's authorization to do so. John Poindexter didn't need a legal opinion telling him he could keep Reagan in the dark. They all just did it. The doctrine of plausible deniability didn't create this behavior. It just gave it a name. It provided a rationale, a justification, a professional vocabulary. It made the practice respectable, something you could testify about before Congress without apparent shame. But the practice itself is as old as the executive branch, as old as the gap between the president's theoretical authority and his practical ability to know what the people beneath him are doing. The buck stops here. It's a fine motto. It expresses the truth about constitutional responsibility. The president is accountable. The president is in charge. The president answers for what the executive branch does. But accountability requires knowledge. You cannot answer for what you don't know. And if the people around you decide you shouldn't know, whether to protect you or to protect themselves or to pursue their own agenda, or simply because telling you would be inconvenient, then the buck never arrives. It doesn't stop anywhere. It just circulates endlessly through a system designed to make sure no one is ever quite responsible for anything. Harry Truman kept that sign on his desk for his entire presidency. Somewhere in the files of the National Security Council, there was a document he had signed authorizing a system of operations he could plausibly deny. He probably never thought much about the contradiction. Most presidents don't. Put it more simply, presidents don't know what they don't know.